Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of Game of Thrones Winter's Coming. In today's episode we are going to have a little bit of a discussion topic, if you can call it like that. We are going to take a look at the benefits and issues with mono setups and dual setups, since the game seems to be moving in that direction unless you're a pretty high evolved account, then you can maybe go try still, but mainly the most accounts that I see right now are either running mono setups or running dual setups, and we're talking about how the benefits and issues of each of those actually applies towards each other. And as you can see, we have like several ways of combining certain troops and formations and so on, so there's a lot to pick from, so we'll jump right into it. So, first of all, we might take a look at the most common thing in regarding the mono versus dual setup, which is commanders. Commanders are super useful. They give a huge stat boost, they have special abilities and so on, which can affect each type of setup in various directions. And the benefits and issues with running dual setups and mono setups is the fact that commanders and stats are not totally aligned and are limited in terms of what you can use and what you can't use. For example, if you want to go for a spear setup, then you can go mono spear. You can get commanders that have fairly high spear attack, spear defense, spear health, stuff like that, and are very focused around these specific troop types. The same applies to bows, to ints, to caps and so on. Whereas if you go for a dual setup, you might need special commanders such as Julian, which has stats split around several aspects, but in that case you might end up having one stat that's pretty much dead and not really used that much. For example, if you're running inf spear, then you have the inf buff, the spear buff, but the cav buff will probably be more or less useless, so you don't really have that applying to it. And then there's of course other commanders such as Rhea, for example, that's total health, infantry and cavalry attack, which is pretty much geared towards being able to be used in a dual setup, and those kind of commanders are pretty much needed also in dual setups if you want to run dual, of course. And then there's of course the total commanders such as Zack or Kevin, which have stats that apply to all troop types that are in your formation, but the stats are obviously only half or something like that compared to what other more specific commanders have in terms of troop types. So obviously you can see that you can roll much higher stats in terms of going mono compared to going dual, and that can have a huge influence in terms of how well you can take hits or deal out damage in that regard. So another really big part in terms of formations and stats are weapons, and weapons come out in many different ways and variations, which of course makes them flexible in terms of how you want to use them. In terms of going mono setup, you are pretty much set to go in the sense that you can just put your commanders that are spear focused like Jaime or Miranda, stuff like that, and just drop the weapon that you need on top of them, and you get the spear bonus and total health, and they get their awakening skills of course increased and so on. So it all synergizes really well, gives them a huge boost. Whereas if you're going dual, you'll probably have different types of commanders which have different types of stats on their weapons, which then furthermore also increases or decreases certain things in terms of the optimal stats that you get out of it. And this of course also means that you are running a much more, how to say it, complicated composition in terms of using your weapons. Mainly because, as you can see here, for example, Zack, that the total stats are much lower compared to Spear, and not only that, but even though it's a total stat weapon, then it might not get the specific stats that you actually require. For example, here we have an infantry red weapon Oath, and if we look at the random stats that you can get from it, you can see that there are certain stats that are universal, like total attack, total defense, total health, and then there are specific stats for infantry base, for example, infantry attack, infantry defense, and you can see that those stats are much much higher than the universal stats, as well as the specific stats for reduction so on, which are high, of course. And this obviously means that weapons have a huge impact in terms of mono, because you just have to roll specific stats like infantry base, infantry attack, infantry health, and so on and so on. And that way you can increase your stats even further, combined with the commander stats that also have a higher base, combined with the actual just base weapon stats, which are also higher base compared to totals, and splitting up your stats into two different troop types, where you probably want to go defensive stats on your front line and full offensive stats on your second row, and use your front line as a sort of tank to absorb whatever is coming towards you. And weapons makes this a lot more complicated, and one thing that we have to look at is, for example, the reduced damage aspects, which is something that's very specific. For example, here you can see like it's reducing enemy cavalry versus allied infantry damage, which means that if you're running two troop types, this loses a lot of value, but if you're running one troop type, then this actually increases the value a lot. And we will take a look at how this actually applies in a battle report. So here we have the bottom section in terms of stats for battle reports, and there are a bunch of numbers here that a lot of people don't really understand how they work or what happens, and so on and so on. And it's pretty simple. These stats apply to your own side, which is the infantry versus infantry damage, infantry versus cavalry, and so on. So in my case, for example, if I use infantry, then my infantry will only do 50% damage towards enemy cavalry, whereas my infantry the enemy cavalry will do 200% damage versus my infantry, for example. And in this particular case, it's very important to note how mono versus dual setups actually work, because dual setups have that benefit that they can run something in those two formations that will hard counter the enemy, in a sense that if you're running inf spear, then even if the enemy uses cav towards your inf, if your inf is strong enough and your spear has high attack, then you might actually still win the match or the fight, because the spears are killing the cavs faster, or enemy cavs faster, than they are killing your infantry front row that's taking the damage. And another thing is the fact that because you're focusing on splitting up your damage, then of course it's also possible that even if someone is running a mono setup, then if that mono setup isn't strong enough, then you will still win with a dual setup. And the issue with mono setups is the fact that you get hard countered, and you can see that, for example, if you're running mono infantry, that you're only doing 50% damage towards cavs, while cavs do 200% damage, which means that they do 4 times as much damage towards you, which kind of sucks in the sense that you pretty much get slaughtered. Even if you have 1000 stats across the board, if the enemy then has 500 stats across the board, you will probably lose the fight anyways, because of the fact that they deal 200% damage, which really hits hard. But the weapons have something that's called reduced damage, which we already talked about in the section before. And in this case, I had a weapon with bowman reduced damage, which shows here that enemy infantry or enemy bowman will do less damage towards infantry, or my infantry. In this case, the damage is reduced by 1.6%. And if you stack up enough of that while pumping up your numbers in terms of mono stats for infantry, for example, then at some point you will actually need someone that's extremely well specialized at cavalry to actually make a dent in you. And even then, that might not be the case, because right now I believe you can get the damage, counter damage, down to 140-130%. and at that point you actually end up not having a huge gap by doing it 4 times, but have like a 2 point something gap instead. And this means that if the enemy is running mono, or isn't running mono, is running tri or dual, they might actually struggle to take you down even though they counter you, because the stats has such a huge difference. And that can be a huge thing, mainly because with weapons, we already talked about that the stats differences are that big. The same applies to, of course, what's it called, commanders and so on. And the same also applies to actually to equipment. So certain equipment you can throw in certain badges focused around that. And since you can put in 4 badges for your specific troop, then if you're running mono, then you can actually have the advantage even though you get countered. If the other account, of course, is running a dual or tri account. And this is why there's a huge debate between if mono is stronger or weaker than dual, because duos actually can get overrun by monos if they're unlucky. So it's fairly balanced still. It depends really on how you have set up your account and how your account plays out, of course, at this point in time. I personally am working toward probably going mono, since I like the idea of just investing into one specific thing, which is much easier. But a lot of accounts are going duo, and I can't really say which one is better, but there are strengths and weaknesses on both sides. Certain types are easier to counter, but those counters can be reduced to a certain point where it's becoming really hard to counter you. But of course, this also requires a lot of investments and a lot of effort put into that specific troop type, of course. But I hope you liked the video, even though it was a bit complicated and didn't really go super deep into the topic, but I like to keep it light and try and keep it somewhat short. So hope you all have a great AC season, have a great weekend, and take care, guys. If you're new to the channel, then of course I would really appreciate it if you like the video and subscribe to the channel. And if you're new to the game or want to play the game, then there's going to be a link in the description below, as well as for the Game of Thrones Winners Coming Discord group. And that's pretty much all for me today. So have a nice weekend, guys. Bye bye.